Josef Fritzl, at first glance, was an ordinary man whose life did not arouse suspicion from others. In the small Austrian town of Amstetten, he lived with his wife Rosemary and seemed to everyone to be an exemplary family man. This man, who had worked as an electrician all his life, did not attract attention to himself. Neighbors often saw him in the mornings when he was on his way to work, and in the evenings when he returned home. He was considered a strict but responsible father, a man whose hard work and perseverance inspired respect from others. Fritzley's house on Sonnenstrasse was old, but well-maintained. Its massive stone walls seemed to symbolize the stability and strength of family foundations. From the outside, this house was no different from other buildings in Amstetten. It had a typical architecture for the region: neat windows, simple plaster, and small gardens in front of the entrance. None of the neighbors could have imagined that there was something more hidden under this house, something terrible and unimaginable. Josef and Rosemary lived here for a long time, and nothing suspicious happened during their entire life together. The district knew that there were several children in the family, but by the early 2000s, most of them were already growing up and leaving their parents' home. For many years, Rosemary was the mistress of this house, and her neighbors considered her a kind-hearted woman. She often visited shops, visited local cafes, and socialized with other residents. But gradually, everyone began to notice that she rarely talks about her family and never mentions one of her daughters, Elisabeth. Elisabeth Fritzl, the youngest daughter of Josef and Rosemary, seemed to have disappeared from the face of the earth. In 1984, when she was only 18 years old, she suddenly disappeared. Josef explained her disappearance by saying that she had run away from home. He claimed that she had behavioral problems and that she got into bad company, after which she left without leaving any note. Then no one asked unnecessary questions. Teenagers often run away, especially when they have conflicts with their parents. My father filed a missing persons report with the police, but a few weeks later he unexpectedly announced that he had received a letter from Elisabeth. In this letter, she allegedly wrote that she had decided to start a new life and did not want to be searched for. The police, having received this letter, closed the case of her disappearance. No one asked any more questions about what happened to Elisabeth. As the years passed, she was gradually forgotten. Rosemary continued to live her life, take care of other children, and Josef Fritzl seemed to be the same strict and determined person as before. His business was going well. He was still working, improving his house, and paying attention to his family. No one could have suspected that behind these years of decent life, one of the most terrible secrets in the history of modern Austria was hidden. On April 21st, 2008, an event happened that changed Amstetten's life forever. A patient in critical condition, a 19-year-old girl named Josef Fritzl, was admitted to one of the local hospitals. Her condition was so severe that doctors immediately began intensive treatment. However, what caused the medical staff the most concern was not only her physical condition but also the mysterious circumstances of her appearance in the hospital. Kirsten was not brought by her parents, but by a man who called himself her grandfather, Josef Fritzl. He claimed that the girl had suddenly fallen ill and that she urgently needed help. When the doctors began to ask Fritzl about how long Kirsten had been ill and what caused her condition, he could not give clear answers. He looked tense, tried to avoid questions, and constantly looked around as if he was afraid of something. These oddities did not go unnoticed, and the hospital staff decided to contact the police, suspecting that something was wrong with this family. When the police first entered the Fritzley house, they could not have imagined that an ordinary-looking Austrian house would turn out to be the site of one of the most monstrous crimes committed in modern history. The house on Sonnenstrasse looked the same as many other houses in Amstetten. Two-story with white walls and a well-kept garden, this house was part of a quiet and prosperous area. Nothing aroused suspicion, and even the nearest neighbors did not realize that a terrible secret was hidden in the basement of this house. However, this house was not just a family home, but a real prison, which Josef Fritzl designed with his own hands to keep his own daughter imprisoned there for 24 long years. Externally, the basement seemed to be an ordinary technical room, typical of old Austrian houses, where tools or old things are stored. But after passing through a massive reinforced concrete door, the police found themselves in another world, a world of fear and despair created by Josef for his daughter and her children. The basement was equipped in such a way that no one would ever suspect its existence. Fritzl spent years thinking through every element of this building, providing complete sound insulation and hiding it behind the ordinary facade of his house. With the skills of an electrician and a builder, he was able to create a real prison from which there was no escape. The entrance to the basement was behind a large closet that stood in one of the utility rooms of the house. This cabinet was fixed so that no one would suspect that there was anything else behind it. Behind it was a massive, reinforced concrete door almost half a meter thick, which could withstand even strong blows. The door was equipped with an electric lock, the key of which was held only by Josef Fritzl himself. No other family member had access to this basement. Rosemary, his wife, never realized that behind that door was the world that her husband had created for his daughter and her children. The police, who went down to this basement during the search, were stunned. The conditions in which Elisabeth Fritzl and her children lived were inhumane. The basement consisted of several small rooms that were connected by narrow corridors. The ceilings in the basement were low, which created a feeling of oppressive space. There were no windows, and the only source of light was the weak light bulbs that were installed on the walls. These light bulbs gave off a dim, cold light, creating a gloomy and depressing atmosphere. The basement was damp, and there was a musty smell everywhere. There was practically no ventilation, and the air was heavy and stale. The first room that the police got into was a bedroom. It was the largest of the rooms in the basement, but even it was small by the standards of ordinary housing. There were 3 old metal beds with thin mattresses. The beds were of different sizes, one large for Elisabeth and 2 smaller ones for her children. There were old blankets on the beds, which had long lost their heat-saving properties. There was a closet in the corner of the room, which contained clothes that Josef brought to his prisoners from time to time. The clothes were old, worn, and clearly not intended for permanent wear. There were toys on the floor that seemed to have been there for many years. They were dolls made from improvised materials, several plastic soldiers, and torn picture books. The children were not given access to real books, and the scraps they managed to get were used for entertainment and education. There were handprints on the walls of the bedroom. Elisabeth told investigators that sometimes children playing or out of boredom put handprints on the walls, creating something like drawings. These prints became mute evidence of their imprisonment, their despair and helplessness. The children knew nothing about the world outside these walls, and their ideas of life were limited by what they saw around them in this basement. They had never seen sunlight, did not know what fresh air was, and did not have the opportunity to communicate with other children. Elisabeth tried to do everything possible to make her children feel at least a little better in these inhumane conditions. She trained them as much as possible using what little she had at hand. She told them stories about the world above, but it was hard for them to imagine what the world outside was like. The children born in the basement knew only him. For them, this prison was their whole life. There was another room next to the bedroom which served as a kind of kitchen. This room was even smaller than the bedroom, and there was an old electric stove on which Elisabeth cooked food. Josef Fritzl brought them food once a week, which was barely enough to feed them all. There was almost always the same food in the fridge: pasta, bread, sometimes some vegetables and meat. The prisoners' diet was extremely limited, which affected their health. Children who did not receive the necessary vitamins and nutrients suffered from chronic diseases and weakness. But they never complained. That was the only thing they knew. In addition to the stove and refrigerator, there was a small dining table in this room, where Elisabeth and her children gathered. The table was old and rickety, but it was the only place where they could eat and forget about their torments for at least a short time. The furnishings were so sparse that they didn't even have chairs for everyone. The children often sat on the floor while Elisabeth set the table and tried to maintain at least some semblance of a normal life. She told them that someday everything would change, that they would go outside, but she couldn't tell when that would happen. At the back of the basement was another room, the smallest and most gloomy of all. Here Elisabeth gave birth to one of her children, who died shortly after birth. It was a boy to whom she had never been able to give a name. The birth took place in inhumane conditions, without doctors, without medical care. When Josef found out that the child had died, he took his body and took it upstairs. According to Elisabeth, he cremated the body in the incinerator, which was located in his house, and scattered the ashes in the garden in front of the house. This garden was part of a well-kept area that Fritzl was proud of in front of his neighbors. No one could have imagined that the remains of an innocent baby who died in captivity were scattered in this garden. This crime was one of the most difficult for the investigators to perceive. They couldn't believe that a man who seemed at first glance to be an ordinary citizen could do something so cruel. Josef Fritzl not only locked his daughter in the basement, but also condemned her to years of torment, and her children to a life without light and freedom. This entire basement was carefully designed so that no one would ever know what was going on underground. Everyone who knew Fritzl saw him as a strict but fair man, and even his wife Rosemary did not suspect that her husband had been leading a double life for decades. The police conducted a detailed inspection of the basement, collecting evidence, and trying to reconstruct the full picture of what had been happening here for 24 years. Every corner, every object, every detail of this place said that a family that the world above had never known lived and suffered here. Contrary to all norms of human dignity, Elisabeth and her children were forced to survive in this underground world, completely dependent on the mercy and cruelty of the person who was supposed to protect them. This basement has become a symbol of the evil that can hide behind external decency. In a quiet Austrian town, among well-kept houses and friendly neighbors, there was a place where human life was reduced to a miserable existence in complete isolation from the whole world. A place where for more than 2 decades a tragedy was played out that no one noticed. Fritzl, skillfully hiding his crimes, continued to lead an ordinary life upstairs, going out to work in the morning, communicating with neighbors, and returning home, where his wife was waiting for him, unaware of his dark side. The disclosure of Josef Fritzl's case began with dramatic events in April 2008, when his eldest daughter, Kirsten, became seriously ill. This moment became the key in the chain of events that led to the collapse of the carefully built wall of lies behind which Fritzl's terrible secret was hidden. If it hadn't been for Kirsten's illness, perhaps his crimes might have remained unsolved for many more years. Until the moment Kirsten was taken to the hospital, Fritzl masterfully hid his crimes. His attention to detail and ability to manipulate others allowed him to maintain the illusion of a normal life for years. However, on this day, the chain of events got out of his control. It all started with the fact that the health of 19-year-old Kirsten deteriorated sharply. The girl, who was born in a basement where she had never seen sunlight and had no access to normal medical care, suffered from many diseases for a long time. Poor nutrition, lack of physical activity, limited living conditions, and unsanitary conditions had a strong effect on her condition. However, this time her illness became so serious that Elisabeth, her mother, could no longer contain her panic. Kirsten began to lose consciousness, and her condition became critical. Realizing that without the intervention of a doctor, her daughter could die, Elisabeth begged Josef to do something. It was the moment when Fritzl, for the first time in many years, faced a choice that put his plans in jeopardy. He understood that if Kirsten was not hospitalized, she would die, and then he would have to face the consequences of her death. At the same time, he was aware that taking her out of the basement could jeopardize his secret. Josef decided to take a chance, but he acted cautiously. He took Kirsten out of the basement and took her to a local hospital under his supervision. However, the first suspicions began to arise here. When Kirsten was taken to the intensive care unit, her condition immediately attracted the attention of doctors. Doctors were stunned by the severity of her illness and her lack of any medical history. When asked about her mother or family, Josef did not give clear answers, claiming that her mother was far away and avoided any details about the family. The strangeness in his behavior and the inability to get the necessary information about the patient made the doctors think that there might be something more. The medical staff were alert, and feeling that the situation required immediate intervention by the authorities, they decided to contact the police. The police, who are used to routine cases in the quiet town of Amstetten, did not expect that the call to the hospital would be the beginning of one of the most high-profile investigations in the history of Austria. The investigators who arrived at the hospital began by interviewing Josef Fritzl. His story that Kirsten was abandoned by her mother did not seem convincing to them. Moreover, he refused to provide any contact with the girl's mother, which aroused even more suspicion. Fritzl's silence, his clumsy attempts to evade questions, only increased the tension. Doctors continued to try to save Kirsten, but her condition remained extremely serious. The doctors insisted that the girl's mother be found and interviewed immediately. The police, beginning to suspect something was wrong, decided to take active action to find Kirsten's mother, who, as it turned out later, was much closer than anyone could have guessed. During further investigation, the police managed to put pressure on Josef, and he was forced to bring Elisabeth to the hospital. This step turned out to be fateful. Elisabeth, coming out of the basement for the first time in many years, did not dare to speak for a long time. She was afraid for her life and the lives of her children, being under the constant control of her father. However, realizing that her daughter was on the verge of death, she decided to tell her story. When Elisabeth gave her first statement to the police, it was a shock to everyone. She told how she had been imprisoned in the basement of her own house since 1984, being forcibly held by her father. At first, the investigators could not believe what they had heard. However, her story was so detailed and backed up with specific details that the police had no doubt about her veracity. The investigators immediately returned to the house on Sonnenstrasse to conduct a search. That's when they discovered the hidden basement, in which 3 children were found. When the children, born and raised in the basement, first appeared on the surface, their reaction was both stunning and touching. These children, who had never seen daylight, felt no fresh air, and knew nothing but enclosed spaces and dim light bulbs, suddenly faced a huge and bright world, the existence of which was a real revelation to them. Their eyes, accustomed to the semi-darkness, reacted painfully to sunlight, and the children instinctively squinted, trying to realize what they saw for the first time. They were shocked by the sight of the sky and clouds, these vast spaces that seemed endless and frightening to them. One of the boys, looking at the clouds, asked in amazement, "What are those white spots in the sky?" He couldn't understand that there was a world so vast and alive. The first steps on the ground, the first sensations of the grass under their feet, the wind touching their faces. All this was new and amazing for them. They touched the grass with timid delight, as if they did not believe that such softness existed. The world that had previously been only in her mother's words suddenly became a reality. The birds flying by made them freeze in surprise, and they couldn't hide their joy at seeing the animals for the first time. Although the children were scared at first, gradually their fear was replaced by surprise and joy. They started laughing while playing outside, feeling free for the first time. Elisabeth watched them with pain and joy at the same time. Her children, who had spent their entire lives in an underground prison, finally found the opportunity to live in the real world, and their every new step in freedom was filled with emotions that had previously been inaccessible to them. After Elisabeth gave her testimony, the police arrested Josef Fritzl. He offered no resistance. For the first time in all these years, he realized that his double life had been revealed, and it was impossible to continue the deception. Investigators began interrogations, trying to understand how he managed to hide his monstrous crime from others, including his own wife, for so long. The investigation continued, and every day more horrifying details were revealed. The questions that the investigators asked became more and more specific. How did Fritzl manage to hide the existence of the basement? How did he provide conditions for the maintenance of his daughter and her children? And what exactly made him choose this path? Each response only increased the shock and bewilderment of both investigators and the public. Elisabeth, despite her suffering, gradually began to cooperate with the police, telling more and more detailed details about life in the basement. Her testimony became the basis for the charges against Fritzl, and their veracity was confirmed by both physical evidence and the testimony of children who were released from an underground prison. The trial of Josef Fritzl has become one of the most discussed trials not only in Austria, but also around the world. On March 16, 2009, he appeared in court in St. Pölten, the capital of Lower Austria, to hear a case that shocked the whole country with its horrific content. For many, this trial was not only an act of justice, but also a moment that was supposed to shed light on how such crimes could go unnoticed for so many years. Many accusations were made against Fritzl, which horrified everyone who followed the process. The trial began with Fritzl, without showing much emotion, listening to the charges against him. At the beginning of the trial, he partially denied his guilt, trying to justify his actions. He claimed that he was trying to protect Elisabeth by creating a separate world for her and her children, and denied intending to harm his children. However, these statements were not understood by either the court or the public. One of the most serious charges was the incident with the baby, who, according to Elisabeth, did not receive the necessary medical care, which led to his death. Fritzl then decided to get rid of the remains by destroying them and scattering the ashes in his garden. This fact struck the court particularly deeply, as it reflected not only the cruelty, but also the complete lack of compassion of the accused. From the very beginning of the trial, Fritzl looked calm and detached. He showed no visible emotion as he listened to the accusations against himself. At the first hearing, he partially admitted his guilt, but insisted that his actions were motivated by caring for his daughter and children, whom he allegedly wanted to protect from the outside world. He claimed that he had created his own environment for them, not seeing outright evil in his actions. However, his attempts to present himself not as a villain but as a man who acted in the interests of his family caused confusion and condemnation from those present.
And keeping her locked up in the home's basement for more than 24 years.
The key moment of the trial was the presentation of video recordings with the testimony of Elisabeth Fritzl, who for 24 years had been a victim of brutal violence by her father. Elisabeth, in order to avoid meeting her father in the courtroom and not expose herself to additional trauma, did not attend the hearing in person. Her testimony was recorded on video, which was presented as the main evidence. On this recording, Elisabeth told her tragic story, how her father locked her in a basement in 1984, how he regularly committed sexual acts against her, which led to the birth of 7 children, 3 of whom spent their entire lives in this basement, not seeing the light of day. The judges and the jury held their breath as they listened to her story. The video lasted for several hours and described in great detail the nightmare that Elisabeth had been experiencing for more than 2 decades. She talked about how she desperately tried to find the strength not to break down and survive for the sake of her children, despite the inhumane conditions they were in. She talked about how she tried to maintain their physical and psychological health, despite constant fear and deprivation. When this video was shown in the courtroom, Josef Fritzl lost his outward composure for the first time during the trial. Up to this point, he had maintained a visible detachment, But the moment he heard his daughter's voice, his face changed. In the courtroom, he sat with his head down, unable to stand a direct look at the screen. This was the first evidence that his psychological armor was beginning to break down. The day after the demonstration of the video recording of Elisabeth's testimony, Fritzl changed his position and admitted full guilt on all counts. This moment became a turning point in the course of the process. His lawyers, who had previously based their defense on a partial admission of guilt and attempts to justify his actions by taking care of the family, lost all grounds for their strategy. Fritzl's confession was clear evidence that he was aware of the full scale of his crimes, although he tried to avoid full responsibility to the last.
Fritzl was jailed for life in 2009 for fathering 7 children with his...
On March 19, 2009, the court issued a verdict. Josef Fritzl was found guilty on all counts. For this, he was sentenced to life in prison without the right to early release. The judge noted that Fritzl's crimes go beyond the usual understanding of human cruelty, and that his actions deserve the most severe punishment. In his closing remarks, the judge emphasized that this case shocked not only Austria, but the whole world. It has become a symbol of how deeply evil can be hidden, even if it occurs within the family, and how important it is to pay attention to the slightest signs of violence. The Austrian judicial system has been tested for strength, and this process has become indicative of how important it is to protect the rights of victims and ensure justice, even in the most complex and complicated cases. Josef Fritzl was sent to a maximum security prison, where he was to spend the rest of his days. This verdict was a kind of act of retribution for the years of suffering he had caused his daughter and her children. Elisabeth, despite all the trials, was able to achieve justice, although her path to restoring a normal life was just beginning. The public was relieved by the end of the trial. This moment became an important stage in understanding how such cases can go unnoticed for such a long time, and what measures need to be taken to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The Josef Fritzl case has revealed the horrifying truth about hidden domestic violence. His crimes shocked the world, and the victory of Elisabeth and her children became a symbol of fortitude. This case highlighted the importance of protecting victims and the vigilance of society in the face of hidden evil.